Welcome to the Associated Church Press podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder. This is a space where professionals in Christian media share real stories, successes, challenges, and lessons learned so we can connect, collaborate, and grow together in today's changing media landscape. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to have in our studio Jason Byassee, of now the senior minister of Timothy Eaton Memorial Church in Toronto. So welcome to the program, Timothy. Or Jason. Oh my God, I totally muffed that.
I'll
So
take it.
Jason, it's
I'm
good to
not
have
Timothy Eaton, but I wish I had his money.
I know, wouldn't that be kind of fun? But I'm glad you're here. And one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the program was that you are going to be one of our speakers at the Associated Church Press Conference in Toronto this spring, May 13th. I'm really glad you can fit us in amongst travel plans to Baylor. And our theme this year is reaching across divides. And we thought you would be the perfect person to kind of kick off that theme for the conference. So for those of our listeners who don't know that you're a decorated author, have worked in both the US and Canada, tell us a little bit more about you and sort of how you are reaching across divides.
Thanks. Yeah, I've always felt like my career has sat across things that normally split apart. And so I've tried to be an academic and a pastor. I've tried to work now in Canada and the US. I've tried to work the kind of mainline evangelical fault line. More recently, I've tried to smudge the line between mainline Protestants and Judaism. Um, I guess I just feel like the contested place where we find our identity by saying the other is bad um, is precisely where we end up learning from God. Oh, our identity is more complicated than we thought, and more interesting, and more of a gift. So I didn't plan it to be that way, but it's been a realization over some decades.
Well, and I love how that kind of tension between, when you're thinking of reaching across divides, sometimes, we come at it and thinking of compromises or pulling someone to one side or the other. But the way you framed that really feels almost like an internal tension. Am I getting that right? Are you seeing that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to use a less neuralgic point, just because it's from my own life, when I was writing my dissertation, I decided to take a little country church as pastor, and someone in the academy who had served churches said, there will be times when you miss things here at the school because of your pastoral ministry. That's fine. Don't tell them that's why you miss them. In other words, both the academy and the local church are jealous of one another and jealous for your time.
Oh,
So
interesting.
just quietly ghost out and don't tell anybody why. And in fact, I did that a couple of times. Now, it's odd because the academy only exists to serve the church. The
Right.
church doesn't exist to serve the academy in the same way, but they do need one another. And perhaps precisely that's why they're jealous for people's time and attention.
Well, and I do feel like pastoring is a situation where everyone's kind of wants a piece of you. Everyone wants, their face time and their spiritual fulfillment, and they really do look to that pastor as the focal point. So that, in terms of even within a congregation, and was that small community, was that when you were in Boone, or was that
That was a
elsewhere?
previous career. I
Okay.
was in Caswell County, rural North Carolina.
Okay, so you've really gone deep in the rural world and then come into Toronto. That's another divide. But how is that? And in some of your books, I think you kind of hit that that divide in witnessing the church in different types of communities. Can you talk a little
Yeah,
bit about that in your
sure.
books?
One thing I loved ministering in Caswell County, I wrote a book called The Gift of the Small Church, where I talked about this. I mean, I only had 20 or 30 people there on a Sunday, but I
Mhm.
tended to know their cousins' names, right? Like I tended to be really deep in the community. The strange thing about pastoring in North Toronto is it's also a small town in that I can't really gossip about anybody without accidentally informing on someone in the room who's related to them. So there's a weird way in which this neighborhood Forest Hill, really affluent neighborhood in Toronto is not unlike Caswell County. I just assume everyone's related to one another or went to high school with each other, dated each other, hated each other, or beat each other out for some job or something. There is a kind of American pattern where you go away to university and then you go away some other place for your career and then you keep moving.
Hmm.
Here in Canada, at least kids in Toronto and Vancouver tend to go away for university if they do, and then come back and then
Oh,
live
interesting.
here.
Hmm.
And so I've been surprised and pleased to find that kind of American middle class pattern differs in this part of North America.
Well, and so I live in Baltimore, and very much it feels like, there's so many people. Like, I grew up in this area. I went
Yeah.
away to school. I came back, and I've been there ever since. And that feels, very comforting because you kind of know how it all works. And, like the idea of just pulling up stakes and kind of recreating yourself or moving in different places. That's e exhilarating, but it also, I think, just takes up a lot of mental energy to be able to do
Yeah.
that, and you pulled up stakes and moved across international lines. How was
Too many
that?
times. Yeah. I mean, for some reason, your way of putting it reminds me of the comments about someone who's getting married again after a divorce. He knows he's bringing himself with him into this next marriage, right? Like,
Mhm.
pulling up stakes can just be a way of not dealing with something and thinking if you change the scenery, that'll help. But then you bring yourself with you, right? I mean, in a way, that's kind of like what's made the United States greatness. These were people willing to go somewhere else with a kind of hope.
Mhm.
In another way, it's made us kind of superficial people who can kind of easily blame other characters in our life for whatever's wrong. Um,
Mm.
so we have moved a fair bit. My wife and I wanted to raise our kids outside the U.S. at some point. We were some of the
Mhm.
only people who actually left the country around the 2016 election. Lots of people threatened to. We
Mhm.
didn't do it for politics. We think we did it for Jesus. And our kids assume that healthcare should run through the government and that transit should be excellent. Those are not sort of United States assumptions, but I guess there's a weakness there too. They don't really know where they're from. So not unlike military kids or diplomats' kids, they know a lot of cool places but aren't sure where home is. And
Mm.
yeah,
So as I'm just mulling on reaching across divides, I mean, like that also some of these are internal, some of these are external, and I'm not sure that anyone really has the answer of reaching across divide. But what do you think the goal is when you're thinking about some of the really um, serious divides that sort of make you either want to pull up stakes or say, I'm going to recreate this and not wanting to, like, w- what do you think goes into the divide to make it happen? And
mm,
then what do you want out of the situation when you're reaching across that
mm,
divide?
that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I suppose thinking Christianly for a minute, we think every divide has been crossed, bridged, undone in Jesus Christ, his incarnation, his resurrection. Um, and so there's a way in which when I see a divide, I kind of think, okay, this is artificial. We made this. It's not real. It's
Mm,
not forever.
mhm.
Someone's benefiting from it or it wouldn't exist. And it has some rationale that good people buy into or it wouldn't exist. Um, and yet it's only there to be transgressed, finally. So that's going to require a kind of loss on either side of the perceived divide, some kind of death. But there'll be a promise of new life at the end of it. So one of the ways I think about that is Christians being Trinitarian, whenever we see a binary, something going like that, we think, okay, there has to be a third. There's always a third. We
Right.
think there's a
The third
third
way.
even in
Yeah.
God.
Hmm.
And so what is that third? It's there. We just haven't found it yet, or it hasn't found us. Um, I mean, at the minute, Canada and the US are in this strange place that hasn't been the case in anyone's lifetime. Canadians on this side of the border, I think, are still befuddled. Like, hey, we thought things were fine. And then all of a sudden, someone's throwing haymakers at us.
Yeah.
Others have said, wait, you're picking on Canada? That's like finding the nicest kid on the playground and picking a fight with them. And Canadians, I think, are genuinely divided. There's part of them that thinks, well, you swing back twice as hard. It's kind of a hockey mentality.
Hmm.
But Canada's a middle power and doesn't really have the wherewithal to do that. But it has a lot of pride, right? So um, I guess I find myself trying to tell stories that don't fit the binary very well. So I tell a fair bit the story of Tommy Douglas, who was the architect of Canada's healthcare. He was a Baptist minister in Manitoba,
Hmm.
and this was early 20th century. And he found himself saying, well, a new pool table would be great, but what these kids really need is healthcare. And so he got elected to the provincial legislature and passed province-wide healthcare, and all the doctors went on strike. They said it's a
Really?
communist plot. Yeah.
Because you
Sound
would
familiar?
think,
I know.
gosh, the doctors might feel like more people are coming in,
I
preventative
know.
care,
Well,
all that good
eventually,
stuff.
the people in Manitoba said, yeah, we like it. We're going to keep it. And so the
Hmm.
doctors came back to work. And so technically, Canadian healthcare is not federal, it's provincial. It's just the
Oh, is
feds
it? Okay.
mandate it, and then it's run through each of the provinces slightly
Oh, I see.
differently. Um, and it was born in a Baptist youth group. Now, the NDP party that birthed that is Canada's Socialist Party, and they're not really excited about the kind of Christian origins of that story. So they don't tell Tommy Douglas's story. But when the CBC ran a poll of the most admired Canadian in history, Tommy Douglas finished number one, and a certain hockey player named Gretzky finished like eighth or ninth.
Wow.
So, there's a weird way in which, Canada thinks Canadian healthcare is existential. That's how we know who we are. But we've dropped the Christian bit of that. Now, if you reintroduce the Christian bit of it in an American context, that could be fruitful, it seems to me. But no one's doing that.
So that's such. So how would you just? I'm curious because how would you reintroduce the Christian aspect of
Yeah,
that into the U.S.? Because right now,
right,
like being Christian is kind of fraught in the U.S. I think there's been with
right,
the rise of Christian nationalism, and that's something that the Associated Church Press kind of has been discussing at the board level. Like,
right,
how can we push back against that Christian nationalism because and kind of reclaim
right,
Christianity. So just in that paradigm of healthcare, I'm
right.
interested, like what do you see
It's a
from
great
your
question, and it's an obvious follow-up to the story I told, but I don't have a great answer for you,
That's why we don't
unfortunately.
rehearse these things, you know?
I think it's a mistake for the left, whether Christian or not, to cede the high ground of a strong sense of identity to somebody else. And so the left often sounds like, well, we need to be less religious in order to be more inclusive. I think that's probably exactly backwards.
Mm.
So I'm struck. Friends of mine have taught at institutions around Chicagoland that are trying to kind of reclaim their Christian identity as universities. And they find that Muslim families become more comfortable sending their kids to those schools the more they bang the Christian drum.
Oh,
Because if in
interesting.
a Muslim worldview, you think, well, okay, they're not my religion, but the fact that they're religious means I trust them more, right?
Right.
So it's a kind of myth, I think, in the left in Western societies that says less religion equals more open. I just don't believe it. I think that's a construct. Now, I know we live in a fraught moment to say that, where Christianity has been used as a cudgel to sort of bludgeon anyone who's not a certain kind of voter. And yet also the Christianity without which we wouldn't have had the civil rights movement is one we tend to be pretty proud of on the left, right? So um, anyway, I guess I would advise the liberals with whom I share a desire for healthcare to be equitable and for poor people to have full access to healthcare the same as rich people, talk about Jesus and say why that's a Jesus commitment for you, and don't
Mhm.
just talk about rights or equality.
Well, and it really, to me, it sounds like it feels like it comes out of like speaking the truth of your values and really being intentional and thoughtful about what Christian values means to you instead
Right.
of like using this code word.
Right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I have to worry about this in Canada too, because Canadians, it seems to me, watch more Canadian American media than Americans do. Right?
Oh,
There's
interesting.
because we're helpless, we fixate on what's happening and then kind of run up to each other and we're like, oh man, can you believe what they've done? Yeah, I can. It's been happening for a while now. It's gonna get worse. And so to try and say the J word and talk about Jesus in that context, I don't know. I guess I think Jesus is kind of our best play. Like, Jesus always fits awkwardly, whatever position you have. Wherever you're coming from, he offers both love and judgment and transformation. And so I just think, okay, whatever we're talking about, the resurrected rabbi from Nazareth is going to befuddle us and then finally save us. But it's going to hurt first.
Mm. And it just strikes me as you are talking, we're talking about the divide, that it's that moment of confusion or like being off your game and not having your soundbite or your snappy answer coming back, that you can really, get to more of an understanding. And I
Yes.
wonder, and we got a little bit off track because it's interesting to talk to you, but I wanted to also understand, part two of that question was like,
Yeah.
what does reaching across divide really mean? Like, what does that look like at the end?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll just tell a story. So in my academic work, starting in graduate school, I was really committed to doing Christian theology in a way that's in love with our Jewish elder siblings in faith. But it didn't affect my day-to-day life very much because I ministered in Castle County, in Boone, now a little bit more in Chicago, but I was a journalist there, a little bit more in Vancouver, but I was a professor there.
Hmm.
Now in Toronto, the two biggest religious buildings are two enormous synagogues,
Oh, really?
one of the biggest in North America, and then one of the most important, a conservative and a liberal synagogue. Um, and I'm struck in Christian conversations with Jews, generally we Christians kind of muffle the Jesus bit. We're not really fooling anyone. They kind of know he's our guy, right?
Well,
And so there's a
yeah.
bit of bad faith in trying to say, well, we're just not going to talk about Jesus, so that way we'll get along. And I realized this because they had me speak at both of these synagogues, and then both of those rabbis preached at my church. And the same stained glass maker did the stained glass windows in the Reformed synagogue and in my place. And in the Reformed synagogue, they start with Abraham and they go up to Einstein, right? Just thousands of years of history. At my place, they start with Jesus's announcement of his conception and they go to his resurrection, right? And they look the same, but it's like, yeah,
It was a wild 33 years, though,
I mean, a lot happened. But like, what are we going to cover those up so the rabbi feels comfortable? She knows what she's walking into, right? They're
Right.
used to being a minority. And the more you get to know Jews, the more they'll trust you and say, you know what? When we think about Jesus of Nazareth, we feel a kind of kinship, a Jew who was misunderstood, mistreated, and crushed by the state. Like,
Hmm.
we got stories about that. That sounds familiar. Now, don't try and jam him into our faith.
Right.
And also you should listen next.
Mm.
So I've just been struck by being a Christian in Jewish space and being received with deep gratitude and respect, rather than trying to be incognito in a space that we pretend is neutral, which is
Mm.
kind of the modern liberal dream.
Well, and I wonder, are there really any neutral spaces? And this kind of
Right.
like clicks into, in Chicago, you worked as a journalist, still person of faith, very, very deeply involved. But, in news media, there's and I don't know if it's just news media, but like, can you ever truly be
Yep.
neutral?
Yep.
How can you be, because you're always bringing your own bias and you always have your own point of view. You're a real person. So like when you're talking about, I'm interested in sort of where you come from that from a journalism perspective, but then
Right.
also in the reaching across divides space. Can you be neutral ever?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is one gift that postmodernism gave us. Otherwise, it seems like it was just sort of a source of really contentious academic seminars in the 80s where we all read French philosophy in translation and debated whether meaning meant anything.
Oh, that sounds scarring.
I know it's troubling, really. Clove cigarettes were involved. It was ugly.
Of course.
So, and clearly they're right. There's no sort of, no party who's above the fray and without commitments that would impinge on our objectivity. I still think there are reasons to uh, to aim for a kind of chastened objectivity that makes sense in certain styles of journalism. The kind I practiced was a kind of theological journalism that tried to say, okay, we're offering reflection for mainline Christian churches in North America that are in decline. That's who we are. Given who we are, who are you, and what do
Hmm.
we stand to learn from one another? The difficulty with that style of journalism, and you'll know this better than me, is it feels like, okay, by the time you get done with an interview, you've started to actually kind of figure each other out, and then you're like out of time. Like, well, we only get 2,000 words. I'm sorry, right? And that's one of the amazing things that media has opened up with the podcast format and with some different formats. Um, uh, so no, I don't think neutrality or objectivity are possible. They can be a useful fiction, and I've never myself been particularly hamstrung by trying for them.
Hmm. Well, and I think for journalists, or people working in news media, like being transparent about where they're coming from.
It's way
And
better.
and I also feel like as we get to that idea of reaching across divides, like that, to me, reaching across divides gets to understanding. Like that,
Yes.
for me, that would be the goal. I'm
Yes,
interested, and it sounds like you're there too.
for sure.
Um,
Yeah, my analogies are always to a good conversation over drinks, where you're curious about the other. And um, and this is tricky. I generally think, like a good conversation, there has to be some two-way exchange.
mhm.
But of course, when you're in journalism and you're interviewing someone, nobody really cares who the journalist is. The interesting
Sure,
party is the one
right.
being profiled or interviewed. Anyway, tricky, right?
Well, and I mean, it comes down, I think, to skill in interviewing sometimes too, because you're not going to get that information out if you're not making that person feel comfortable
That's
or
right.
seen or
Yeah,
even trusted that you're going to carry that message. And I think
right.
that's I from where you sit, you see a lot of faith journalism. And so sort of what do you think is going right? Like where would you point
Yeah,
to some like that's doing really well?
yeah, it's a good question. Those of us, who uh, are proud of being ink-stained wretches, can just sort of recite litanies of woe, right? Like, I really miss books and culture.
Hmm.
Um, I really miss this or that religion page that isn't funded anymore.
Yeah.
Um, I do think there's some really good things happening with people's Substack, meaning you can get their thoughts on a lot more things. The problem is who has time to read all of it, right? Like it's
Very
easier
true.
to get published than ever, but harder than ever to get paid for it or do it at a professional level. Um, one of my kids is going into journalism, so I have to think,
Oh,
okay, there's a
congratulations.
future there. I believe in the honor of the fourth estate. And I guess as long as you have anybody out there who's curious, it'll have a future. It's nice to eat though, right?
Yes, it is. And I do feel like there's never been a more and there's probably journalism is always important. And I think the people need news and information that affects their lives and prompts them to think more broadly about, how they exist in the world. And that need is not ever going to go away.
That's right.
But how that can be done is changing radically. And, Substack certainly is coming into that marketplace. Um, but I still think that there's a place and a role for that institutional journalism because
Yeah,
it
agreed.
says like when you think about what the denominational news media is saying, they're reporting on the denomination. So it's like how can these
Right.
really strong institutions, they may not be what they were, 40, 50, 100 years ago, but they're still strong institutions within the world.
Yes.
And that's what we don't always
Right.
take into account.
What you remind me of is there's an Anglican newspaper. I can't remember the name of it here in Canada. And about once a year, it runs an article with a headline that's something like "The last Anglican in Canada will die in 2035." Right. And, my friends in the Anglican hierarchy are like, we pay for this paper. Every red cent comes from Anglican offerings. And they run these inflammatory headlines about how we're dying. Like, why are we doing this? And the fact is, it's just not true in the
Mm,
sense that there are growing and strong Anglican congregations who are going to outlive all of us. There are a lot of ones that aren't growing, and they're going to continue to close and amalgamate. And what's going to happen? That property money is going to go into the Anglican coffers, and they're going to plant more churches. So
mhm,
the story is not actual. I mean, it's not untrue. It's just it fits with a certain Western narrative of religion going away, which is untrue. And then why the church should subsidize that false narrative. Yeah.
Well, and I think also you get the like, how can you create a different story? Like, that's an easy story. Like, oh, we see churches closing all the time.
Right.
But I see faith communities and journalism kind of in parallel
They're very similar.
because both are contracting, but they're still important. They're still always going to be important,
Right.
and they're changing radically.
Right.
And I think in order to be like a good doing good acts of journalism, you have to
Yes.
reflect the communities that you serve.
That's right.
And that is also a tension and a divide. Like, how do you bridge that sort of you go to church for, X amount of time and you do this and you do that
Yeah.
versus people who are feeling more spiritual and want to engage with
Yeah.
their faith in different ways. And
Yeah.
so bridging, like on a very practical level, there's esoteric divides, there's practical divides. What are you seeing in terms of
Yeah.
those kind of divides in your own work? Because
Yeah.
you're in charge of growing I mean, your
Yeah.
congregation's in charge of growing the church, but you're the
Right.
head of that congregation.
Yeah. Uh, uh, one of my biggest givers when he first met me said, "So you're the new head of the church?" And I said, "I think that's Jesus, but I'm happy to do my best." He brings that up every time I see him, once a year. Um, And the reason I was smiling before, you reminded me of a story that Pope Benedict XVI liked to tell of Napoleon gathering the Catholic cardinals in France and saying, "We must destroy the Catholic Church." And one of the cardinals said, "But sire, not even we've been able to do that." Um, like the church is always dying because it's run by nincompoops like me, right? And yet the Holy Spirit is always revolutionizing things and raising up people who are going to do it differently. I've heard this argument made that sort of prestige journalism and mainline churches have been in a kind of parallel decline, and that maps out in terms of the money, the years, and so on. And I sort of smile because I mean, the first, newspapers in the United States often just ran whole sermons, right?
Mm.
And I mean, I think we should just go back to that, and everything will be fine, don't you think?
That'll hit everybody. That'll be
That's
great.
right. I mean, people will pay for that, no question.
Yes, 100%. Don't worry about all that crazy social media
I
stuff.
guess as long as people pray and as long as people are curious about their neighbor, then these forms of interaction will find a way to arise.
Mhm. Right. No, I wonder also, like, in that, I'm just when we think about, like, bridging and reaching across that divide, and if we think that understanding is the goal, that doesn't mean the divide goes away.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so
That's right. Difference doesn't vanish.
right, and there's always going to be difference. There's always gonna be those who want to print the sermon whole scale in the newspaper and others who just wanna, you know, see the TikTok, about the highlights and so forth.
Right.
But, how do you in your work, how have you been really leaning into or living into that reach and that bridge?
Yeah. I'm struck, and maybe this is because I worked in journalism, Rebecca, but how much of my work is storytelling. And I first realized it when I started doing weddings and funerals after I had worked at Christian Century. And I realized um, this is the same as writing a story. Like, I'm going to sit down with people who love this person. I'm going to sit down with this couple, and I'm going to try and discern what did God decide to say that God could only say through this life? What
Mm,
is God trying to tell us that God could only say through this marriage? And that's a different kind of listening than I think most obituary writers, even most family members, certainly most people in a wedding party are thinking about. And I was
mhm.
struck too at my preaching that, and I draw some of this language from Rick Lisher at Duke. Um, each passage of the Bible is unique. And again, God is trying to say something that can only be said through this strange passage. So, what's the uniqueness?
Mm.
Um, so, I really believe in listening to people with granularity and nuance and maybe even surprising them with what comes out. Um, and I'm struck in ministry. If you do this, if you listen to somebody really deeply for a wedding or a funeral or a sermon, they won't believe how cool it is. They'll be like, that's amazing. And you'll think, no, it's just actually, I'm just doing the job.
Just reflecting back, yeah,
Right.
just
All I'm
hearing.
doing is giving you your stories.
Mhm,
But people's stories are amazing, right?
mhm.
They don't know how amazing they are.
Now, do you think it's because people don't often reflect on themselves? They're
Yeah.
like, we're moving so quickly,
Yeah.
and it's hard sometimes to think like, oh, this is what I've done, or this is what it means. Like, I guess when you look back over a life, you kind of shape the narrative. If you think, but I'm curious, when you do that kind of storytelling work and you're coming at it from a paradigm of what is God trying to say through this life, do you, how much of that conclusion is kind of preordained for
Mm,
you?
that's a good question. I think if it's entirely preordained, it just ends up being cliched, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's like a trope, like, oh, struggle, release,
Yeah, right. Aren't we happy they're in heaven? And of course, I'm not objective either in the sense that I'm working on their story with a certain eye to the kind of church I think Christ is birthing in our midst, right?
Mhm,
Um, so I mean, well, let me give you an example. So there's someone we have who's probably dying now, and she doesn't realize how beloved she is, or trusted she is, or what a loss she'll be, right? And I'm imagining what I will say about her is something about how well she listened to other people. And that's why she
mm,
didn't think of herself as a kind of, I'm important, everyone do what I say kind of leader. She wasn't that.
mhm,
Um, but she didn't miss birthdays and she went and drove people to church when she didn't even have any business driving herself. And
mm,
she's the kind of person who glues communities together who doesn't tend to get fanfare, right? And in a way, I can't wait to preach that sermon, right?
yeah,
But in another way, I haven't listened to her kids yet. I haven't listened to her grandkids yet. I haven't listened to her neighbors yet. I haven't gone to the table where people are mourning her death to hear their stories. So I want to hold that first draft lightly enough that something else could knock it off the table and it could go
mhm.
another direction, right? Uh, and then I guess I am struck that we give the impression that preaching is a kind of didacticism, one microphone and lots of ears. I just think it's much more of a conversation and much more ongoing than that. And, my people are not hesitant to say to me, okay, you didn't know that person and you got a lot right, but you got this wrong. And here's what I really
Mhm.
think. And that's what you say sort of, at the rest of the reception after the funeral, right? I don't know.
I love that idea of continuous revelation, though, because,
Yeah.
being sort of humble and open enough to rejigger your worldview in some ways, even if it's about this one specific person. But it feels like what you're describing is almost a feedback loop, that you're coming in with this
Right.
idea based on what you know, you're open to it changing, and you're almost co-creating with
That's right.
those people. And then also maybe you get the opportunity to talk to this woman about what you're like summarizing out of her story, and showing her perhaps I mean, I do hope you get to preach that sermon while she's still here,
Yeah, that's right.
because
That's right.
that's an amazing feedback loop.
I'd much rather her walk in and I get to brag on her that day. The thing is, Canadians really are more awkward about sort of having attention drawn to them in public than Americans tend to be. I mean, I know those are stereotypes, but I found that a little bit true. And
Mm.
so, I mean, it is a little bit of a feedback loop. I could say how cool this person is, and they would say, "No, I'm not." I'd say, "See, that just proves how cool you are." And they would say, "No,
And
I'm
then you get
really
in a little
not."
argument. Okay. No, I'm not.
And I mean, like the best Canadians tend to do is kind of humble brag, right?
Hmm.
Americans, we do tend to stick our chests out a little bit more. I think that's basically true. And it took me living in Britain for a little while to notice that. So, like, when I lived in England for a couple of terms on sabbatical, if we were in a shop, I could tell if American tourists walked in.
Really?
They were just louder, right?
Okay.
Um, uh, and then pretty quickly you learn the sort of British disdain for Americans. Like, you don't have to say anything, you just sort of glare at each other and like anyway. Um, and yet, I mean, like, Canadians have this sort of little brother thing with Americans where we really have been dependent on the US
Hmm.
for trade, for military, for culture, and so on. And we resent it. Um, so that's part of what's been reawakened in the last few years is Canada could be called not America. Like, that's the thing we most know about ourselves.
Hmm.
And so all the talk of ingesting Canada is precisely fitted to make us say anything but that. We don't know who we are, but we know we're against that.
Right. Well, and again, sort of that reaching across divide. If you don't have a core center on who you are, how can
Yeah.
you really talk to someone like because you don't know what your end game is. Like if you don't
Yeah.
understand yourself, is it worth
Yeah.
trying to understand someone else and some of those superficial differences of tension between, you know, culture or nationality,
Yeah.
how does that does that entirely hold you back, or does that kind of provide some of that tension to say, "Oh, I'm not gonna be subsumed by that other person, like, I'm not
Yeah.
giving in on that reach across the divide."
Yeah. I don't know when your listeners will listen to this, but we just had Super Bowl weekend. And so I asked one of my families, "Hey, are you going to watch the game?" And they said, "No, too American." Like, yeah, I don't, this is like the most American thing in the history of America, but it's sort of fun to watch.
Well, and it had a great halftime show,
I
which
mean,
was
that
all
halftime
about
show was
the
something else, wasn't it?
Americas.
I know, it was
Yeah.
incredible. Um, I mean, I do think the decline of Christianity is an ingredient in your question. There was a time when Canada was more church going than the US, sort of
Mm,
directly after the Second World War. Um, English Canada has always been more like Britain in its conjunction of the monarchy, something like an official state church. Um, we were the North America that didn't rebel against British power and are still proud of the monarchy. Um, Whereas America, knows who it is by sort of rejecting all of that. And then French-speaking Canada had its own reasons to be heavily mass-going, and then that fell off the table in Quebec in the Quiet Revolution. Similarly, in Canada, the culture went from, okay, being Canadian means you go to church, to saying, okay, being Canadian means you don't go to church. Like, that
mm,
switch happened not as fast as in Quebec, but in English Canada, it happened more quickly, obviously, than in the U.S.
mhm,
So there would have been a time when you could say, well, to be Canadian means to be the king's subjects in North America. Nobody talks
mm.
that way now, but that would have been a
No.
way to talk once upon a time. And that would have been bound up with a kind of churchly identity and Republican values and so on. That's fine. We'd be embarrassed to talk that way now, but what's replaced it? Like, the only thing left is the not American part of
Mhm.
the identity, right? Which is precisely the neuralgic point that Trump's been sticking his finger in.
Well, and it's so hard
So,
to define yourself as a nothing, like, as a negative, like, "I'm
right.
not." You really
It's not good enough.
and I think I think sometimes you have to work through that and think about, okay, all the things that you're not, but at heart, you have to figure out the value, like what you are, whether that's and that I think only I wonder actually now that we've been talking about it, sort of that reaching across divide, if some of those divides occur because of that sort of othering, like I'm
Yes,
not that, I'm not that, I'm not that. But that is a hollow core because you're not saying what you are. Do you
that's
think
right.
that that leads into divides ever?
For sure. I mean, one thing that's happened in Canada is there's been this burst of patriotism precisely because people can come together around this. Well, I'm not that. But Trump's going to go away at some point, and so is this bellicosity. And
Mhm.
so what's left for Canada other than Voltaire saying it's a few acres of snow, right? Now, I think that's the thing. There's so much that's amazing about Canada that's indifferent to the United States being on our border that Canada is just not very good at celebrating or sort of
Mm.
raising up or touting. And those are all things and so let me give you a glimpse into this. I preached a Canada Day sermon where I basically did a kind of, here's everything that's amazing about Canada. And one of my trusted people said, that was the most American Canadian Day sermon. And she said, because we don't brag. So we needed you, like an American, to brag about how cool we are, right? Like,
Hmm.
and so that's where I kind of want to say to Canadians, you have a lot to brag about. Like, this is an amazing place. And bragging will not make you sound American. Like,
Maybe you
right?
can frame it as quiet confidence or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's right. There was a famous book written in the 60s about how Canada went from being a vassal state of Great Britain to being a vassal state of the United States. And
Mm.
I think we can agree we're not that now. Okay, like let's positively articulate the virtues that we're proud to have.
So I'm thinking ahead to May when
Yeah,
you're going to do our opening sermon at our opening worship on the 13th. So no pressure. And then you're going to get on a plane and go to graduation, which will be
it's
really
true.
exciting.
Yes.
Um, what do you want people to take away from the theme of reaching across divides?
Yeah, I mean, the preacher in me goes immediately to the letter to the Ephesians saying Christ is broken down to the dividing wall. Um, in a way, it's still there, or else the writer of Ephesians, Paul, wouldn't be talking about it. And yet,
Good
it's
point.
a kind of absurdity to act as though it's there because it has already been transgressed. Um, so, uh, so I really am committed to the things we think divide us. They're a kind of useful fiction. There's a reason they're there. Someone is benefiting from them being there. But they're not real. They don't go all the way down. Um, so I have been struck by my fellows kind of inclined toward the left of politics and culture. Every time I turn to the New York Times or Washington Post or the Globe and Mail or wherever, the first 8 or 9 articles will be, here's another way Trump sucks. And here's another
Hmm.
way Trump, all right, cool. Can we maybe ignore him? Because he's not that interesting. We all know what we're dealing with. Let's talk about some other kind of news where someone's creating something beautiful, right? Um,
Hmm.
so again, I think most of our identity on the left has become whatever Trump doesn't like has to be good. Um, no, it can be more interesting than that, more substantive.
Hmm.
So to give one example, there's been some really good journalism about how Minnesota has shown an, a vision of neighborliness that ICE couldn't destroy.
Hmm.
Um, what I would love to hear more about is, okay, this is a state that brought in 1 million Somali refugees, and it was basically churches doing that. Anyone who's ever been in a church knows, like, the speech about how, okay, we're going to support this refugee family from
Right.
Vietnam or Syria or wherever.
Hmm.
That's a kind of bread and not just churches, synagogues do that. Obviously, mosques do that. There's a kind of bread and butter religiosity to welcoming the other. And that's precisely what Trump's stormtroopers couldn't undo as of yet. Um, so it's a kind of religious angle I haven't quite heard come out as much. But I think someone could write that story.
Yeah, and I do feel like it's grounded really much in sort of the radical Jesus idea that you're taking care of the disenfranchised, that you're looking after the least of us.
That's right.
Um,
That's
and you're
just
right, I
me.
don't think that's come up. Do you think, and I felt like we were winding up, but I have one, I just
Please.
need to ask you, um, like the role of, I think sometimes in journalism, mainstream journalism very reticent to even talk about religion or talk
Right.
about spirituality. And
Right.
so because you've been on both sides of that coin, um, how do you feel that journalists could approach not just Christianity, but sort of religion more effectively in their writing? Because I feel like there's a whole chunk of context that just gets ignored because people are scared.
Yeah, that's right. It's the kind of minefield where if you know that if you wander in unawares, something will blow up, and so it's better to just not walk in there, right?
Hmm.
There were some institutional responses where major newspapers said, okay, this is an important part of cultural life. We're going to invest in it. And then most of those investments went away, right? Even though arguably those were really good journalistic returns that resulted from that. Um, I guess I think the most curious and nuanced people I know are good journalists. And they just tend to turn off those skills when they're dealing with faith. except, with some really notable exceptions of really good religion journalists, Eliza Griswold or whoever. And I guess I'd just encourage them that they already know how to ask nuanced questions, how to assume they don't know everything, how to find an expert who goes beyond talking points, and deploy those skills. So the example that comes to mind is not very illuminating, but we're about to do an interfaith event at my church with a Shia cleric. And I'm just struck every time I talk with Shia Muslims, we Christians have a lot more in common with them than we do with Sunni Muslims. I mean, we have to also build bridges with the Sunni community, but with Shia Muslims, we believe in martyrdom being important. We believe in the saints. We believe in holy places. We believe in that there being a kind of redemption in the midst of suffering. There's a reason that lots of Shia think that Jesus is going to come back right before the Mahdi. I don't know what that means. I just feel like that's under-thematized as we try to talk about Abrahamic faiths. And look, it's a lot less sexy to say Muslims and Christians in Toronto get together and make friends. Like, that's not a headline, right?
That is not a headline, I think,
No.
that's going to sell anything. You're right.
And yet, I mean, that's kind of what it means to be a neighbor, a human being, right? Anyhow, I once again have failed to answer your excellent question.
No, but I think, the idea that you kind of are, and it would be too trite to say that, you're looking for commonalities, but if you have places where you can intersect and deepen the understanding, that's
Yes,
what I'm getting out of
that's right.
your comments. But then also as it relates to journalism, just kind of applying the skills that you already have to the subject matter at hand. Like,
Right.
the church as an institution, religion as an institution is a huge part of many people's lives, and we're discounting that. And so that's, I really do feel like the faith journalism community is really doing important work that doesn't always get seen
That's
by the
right.
wider mainstream. But I'm really appreciative of what you are going to be bringing to the
Good.
conference, to your sermon there. And
Thank
I
you.
just so appreciate what you've shared today. It's been such wonderful food for thought.
Good.
And I can't wait to hear more from you in May.
Well, it's lovely to be with you, and I can't wait to see you up here soon. Hopefully, we'll have melted the snow and ice by then.
Yeah, I'm a little bit, y'all are north. It's going to be cold, I think, but we're going to get through it. Can't wait. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Associated Church Press podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Follow us on social media for updates, member stories, and more from the ACP community. Until next time, keep telling the stories at the intersection of faith and journalism.